Hello and welcome to this CNBC Africa special broadcast where we'll speak to one of the candidates vying for the top job at the World Trade Organization and find out his vision for global trade. The seat at the head of the World Trade Organization is currently vacant and after the resignation of Brazil's Roberto Azevedo. The World Trade Organization says the global economy is in its worst downturn and since the 1930s, and they expect the volume of global trade to fall between 13 and 32% this year. My guest today is 58-year-old British politician who has served as the Secretary of State for International Trade and was nominated by the United Kingdom for the role of the Director General of the World Trade Organization. Dr. Liam Fox joins me now to share his views for global trade. Thank you so much for your time on the show today, sir. And definitely it's very different times we're seeing and the world needs a different type of leadership. But I would like to know what is your vision for global trade at a time like this?
Well, I think the World Trade Organization is a great institution. I think it's got great people. I think it's got great institutional memory. I think it's got great technical capabilities. But I don't think it's got the political weight it requires to be able to deal with some of the blockages in the trading system today, which are, to all intents and purposes, political rather than technical. If they were technical, we would already have sorted them out in Geneva. So I think that having a leader that's got political experience, in a wide range of issues and is known and knows many of today's global leaders, I think is a head start for the organization at what is a difficult time. And remember, global trade was actually contracting at the back end of 2019 before the COVID pandemic actually hit. So there were a lot of problems in the system. This is an organization set out to liberalize global trade that hasn't had a substantive agreement on trade liberalization for 25 years, doesn't have a functioning dispute resolution mechanism, and the basic function of getting trade flowing doesn't appear to be working. So there are a lot of issues for a new Director General to deal with, and I think a Director General who comes with experience is beneficial to all the members of the organization.
Definitely strong leadership will be needed, and when you look at the WTO post-COVID-19, I'd like to see when you look at how things are playing out. So do you think, what are your plans for matching up multilateral rulemaking with the pace of change that we're seeing with today's realities?
Well, I think that there is a strong case for getting a recommitment to the concept of multilateral trade rules. The alternative, you have to remember, is chaos, and if you don't have a rules-based system, you'll end up with a power-based system, which only the very biggest countries will be able to navigate, and where a lot of developing and smaller economies will find themselves at the receiving end of whatever the big economies want. That's no way to encourage development or indeed social, political, and security stability across the globe. So I would like to see our members actually recommit to the basic principles of a rules-based system and to recognize that in an open free trading system, which has helped to take 1 billion people out of extreme poverty in just a generation, in that system, we do need rules, and the ability to allow countries to use comparative advantage in their economies to their own benefits is key. I actually believe that free trade is a right. I think that we have a right to sell our goods and services and labor at the price that we decide, and I think as consumers we've got the right to buy what we want at the prices we want without interference from government. So a rules-based system that allows a global free trade system to operate effectively is essential. So the question is how do we deal with some of the post-COVID elements? Well, we've got a ministerial conference coming up in Kazakhstan in 2021, and I think that needs to have two functions. The first is that we need to reset our expectations and policies in light of COVID. It won't be possible for economies to necessarily reach deadlines that have been set for them because of the interruption that COVID will have brought to their economic activity. And we also need to use that conference, I hope, to get our members to physically recommit to the principles that enabled us to complete the Uruguay round. And by that I mean the concept of a shared endeavor, the concept of a common enterprise where we all make compromises so that the global economy can move forward and we can see the developmental goals that we want achieved more quickly.
No doubt the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown a very different spin to how trade is going to be conducted globally. But it's one thing to have these trade agreements in place, but then that's just the beginning of the work. You know, it's another thing to implement, monitor compliance and also transparency across board. And then how do you plan to get better cooperation from members if you are selected to become the Secretary General?
Well, there are a number of things. The first is to get the dispute resolution mechanism back up and running. The ability to resolve disputes according to the rules internally is one of the greatest, probably the greatest value-added element that comes to smaller nations by joining the WTO. It enables them to be treated in a fair and equitable way, along with the bigger countries. And at the moment, that's not functioning. So that's one of the biggest deficits that we have. But then I think we also have to use the talents of our people more. I would like to see us working alongside the other international institutions in a more constructive and a more defined way. I intend to set up, for example, a standing task force on SMEs, because at whatever level of development we find ourselves, we all depend on our SMEs for our economic well-being. 2/3 of global jobs come from SMEs at the moment. About 80% of new jobs are created by SMEs. And whether you're in a developed country, a developing country, or one of the least developed countries, your SMEs require the same three things. They need access to finance, they need access to skills, and they need access to a market. And so I want to set up those three subgroups. I want to bring our members together to use their talents. I want to mix up developing and developed countries in those groups so that they can understand one another's perspective. And I want them to work with those international institutions, whether that's the World Bank or the OECD or UNCTAD or the ILO, whatever they feel is necessary, to develop an agenda which everyone feels that they're part of, rather than something that is applied to them from above. Because I think we need to foster this idea, as I said, of a common endeavor, or we're not going to be able to make the progress that we want. So they're practical suggestions as to how we can actually make progress.
Yeah, but how do you hope to get these countries, who have agreements in place to comply with these agreements they put in place and with the level of transparency that is needed?
Well, part of that is the dispute resolution mechanism, which enables us to hold countries to account. But you're right, transparency is a very key issue. And, this is a member-driven organization that works by consensus, and we expect our members to give us accurate data about their economies. One of the biggest issues is whether countries are using inappropriate state subsidy, which therefore distorts competition for their neighbors and for other countries in the trading system. Now, we have ways of verifying data, and I think that we'll have to look across those international institutions to see whether we can get the systems in place that will enable us to have not just the trust in the declarations that members make, but an ability to verify that data independently. It's been done already on aluminium production, and I think we should be developing the methodology to ensure that we have that. Without trust, it's very difficult to operate a system like we have in global trade. If we can add independent verification, I think that adds to the confidence that members have in the declarations that they may make on subsidy and capacity, and whether or not they're undercutting their competitors unfairly. So we do need to get that done. As I say, the OECD has already done work on that. We need to build upon that methodology.
All right, but it's clearly quite a lot of work to be done when you look at how things play out. But in your view,
yeah, I do think the new Director General will have trouble getting an inbox. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but looking at how things can play out, though, I'd like to know how you think the WTO can best prepare for the future of trade in services, because we understand what technology is doing across board as an enabler in many areas. We're seeing disruptions happen so far. But when you look at the rising uptake in digital services and you see how things play out, what's your vision for that future of trade in services?
Well, I would like there to be a multilateral agreement on trade and services, because trading in services has not liberalized in the same way that trading in goods has over the past 25 years. So we need to get that liberalization done, because a great deal of value is locked up in the global economy by the fact that services are more expensive relatively than goods are. So we have the Trade and Services Agreement that is stalled at the present time. We've got the e-commerce agreement, which is not a multilateral agreement, but a plurilateral agreement. In other words, a coalition of willing countries working together. I think we should move that forward, because these are crucial areas. And the services agenda, and especially on things like e-commerce and online trading, they're tremendous tools for leveling up and for giving opportunities to people who might have found it more difficult to break in to the traditional geographic-based trading system. And I think that's particularly true for women who can take advantage, the evidence tells us, of online trading in a way that they couldn't take advantage of more traditional forms of trade. And getting more women into the global economy is essential for economic reasons, but also for social justice reasons, for political reasons, and for wider security reasons, because we know that economies with a higher number of women active in the economy are less likely to be subject to political radicalization or indeed to armed conflict. So we should see e-commerce and we should see the services agenda not as threatening to developing countries, but actually empowering to developing countries. And I hope we could encourage them to take part in these agreements so that they can help shape them.
All right, but when you look at the continent of Africa and you look at what the continent is doing, trying to get, trade, a regional trade zone, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement coming on board. But I would like to know what your plans are if you should become the new Secretary General, and how you would put Africa in the middle of trade across the world.
Well, I'm in favor of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think that it would bring liberalization and a set of rules across the continent to those countries who were members. I think it enables us to use that trading bloc as a stepping stone to global trade liberalization. If you like, I think there's a hierarchy there. I think if we can get multilateral agreements, great. If we can't get those, then let's look for plurilateral agreements, and if not, let's get regional trade agreements to provide that liberalization. So I think encouragement for that. Of course, it does require the support of the Director General and the WTO to go ahead. I would give that support. I've already spoken to the Secretary General of the Free Trade grouping, and very constructive those discussions were too. And I think it gives us just another lever to be able to ensure that we are able to get trade moving. But again, if we're going to get Africa to really take advantage of the opportunities that it has with a young population, often a tech-savvy population, and a lot of natural resources, we have to go back to that point I was making earlier. How do we help ensure that we've got the investment coming in, right down to microfinance for MISMEs? How do we ensure that we can reduce the market access barriers that are currently in place, mostly from the G20 countries, it has to be said, and how do we get that skills gap developed? And on that point of market access, one of the key things we will need to do if we want to get African trade moving is to reduce the trade barriers that the G20 have. Back at the end of the financial crisis, back in 2009, only 1% of G20 countries' imports were covered by restrictive measures. So it was a very free market. Now, more than 10% of G20 countries' imports are covered by restrictive measures, a huge increase in protectionism in that time, mostly not tariffs, but non-tariff barriers. And those regulatory and administrative costs can be very difficult for poorer countries and less developed countries and their companies and their SMEs to overcome. So that needs to be dealt with, and that is a WTO responsibility, and it has to be something that the Director General, I think, gives precedence to as we go forward. And then we can look to see in the other areas how, through things like aid for trade, we can bring in the technical capabilities to deal with some of the skills gap, and how can we work, as I say, with the World Bank to ensure that finance streams are available. But when the point about and why the G20 non-tariff barriers are so important is that the G20 accounts for 90% of global GDP and 80% of global trade. And that's therefore a very large part of that global market that has now increased increased barriers to access being applied. And that can be pretty difficult for a lot of smaller economies and smaller companies to navigate. So that really has to be something that gets drive from the new Director General.
Yeah, because I ask about Africa because it's quite important, especially for us in this part of the world, talking about inclusion and also ensuring that no country is left behind as the world moves forward into the next phase of what global trade is going to look like. And I'd like you to speak to that and, inclusion and ensuring that no one is left behind, especially when you look at how COVID-19, has played a major role in disrupting a lot of these economies and how they operate.
Well, we've got a number of elements that are unavoidable from COVID. So we had disruption of where our sea traffic was actually being moored at the time of the beginning of the pandemic. So it was an interruption to the flow of seaborne goods. There have been fewer passenger flights, so less air freight being carried. These all have knock-on effects, potentially including on price. But we've had fewer people to do some of the necessary tasks of inspection and certification. And on top of all of that, we've had new export restrictions introduced on things like medicine, medical equipment. Of course, as a doctor, I have a particular interest in that area and ensuring that we get free flow of those goods. But we've also seen restrictions on food, and this is one of my biggest worries, that we know that about 17% of the global population currently depend on free access to agricultural goods to be able to feed themselves. Not a question of choice in the supermarkets, but whether they can actually avoid starvation. I worry that those restrictions will come on top of potentially less planting in crops and potentially smaller harvests with price effects in that. So there's all the more need to open up that global agricultural market to ensure that people are able to access the foods that they require. So that's a very practical sense of where COVID is going to hit us. It may also exacerbate the differences between the richest and poorest countries, which is all the more reason to take forward those measures that I'm suggesting on how countries can boost their smallest companies, because they will be the elements that provide that inclusion, including for women, in these economies. And I go back to that point, we need to focus on the practical issues. How do we get finance? How do we get the skills? And how do we get the market access? Without that, talk about inclusion is just rhetoric. And I think that one of the problems of the WTO is that people have seen it as being less relevant in recent years. So we need to get back to talk about the actual issues that affect real people, real businesses, real economies, and have a bit less abstract discussion at Geneva. So what I want is a very pragmatic approach to deal with the things that actually matter to the people who will be watching your program.
What are your plans for getting the WTO to deal with the issues that matter, like you rightly mentioned?
Well, as we deal, first of all, with the COVID. No, we have to deal with the issues that actually are affecting the global economy. So COVID, we need to be in crisis mode for. We need to be ensuring we remove those temporary restrictions. We need to make sure that we're able to get these foods and medicines moving in the global economy. Then we need to deal with some of the ramifications that will come from that, of potential increases in the differential between the richest and poorest countries, and deal with those, and perhaps reset timetables that we have to for that. And then, as I said, deal with the real economy. We've got, as you correctly pointed out, we've got a stalled agreement on services. We've got a stalled agreement on agriculture. We've got a stalled agreement on fisheries. Here you have an agreement that's all about removing illegal subsidies for fisheries and about sustainability and the quality of the oceans. Now, why is it that when there's hardly a young person on the planet who does not worry about the health of our oceans, that we've been unable to utilize public opinion to be able to persuade governments to make the compromises necessary to get the fisheries agreement in place? And I think that the WTO needs to be able to use the tools that are used in business and in politics, including mobilizing public opinion, to be able to get some of these blockages removed by the government. So those are the issues. And then you go beyond into issues like climate change. We've got a blocked environmental goods agreement. And that environmental goods agreement is there to ensure that things like solar panels and blades for wind turbines, things that can help us have lower cost sustainable energy, can move freely in the global economy, and they're still blocked. So if we actually want to make progress in any of these really big areas, how do we help eliminate poverty? How do we get more women back into trade? How do we protect the oceans from unfair and distorted trade practices? How do we get agriculture operating in a way that doesn't have distortive subsidies from some of the world's richest countries? How do we get environmental goods moving so that we can ensure that developing countries can get access to clean energy generation and not have to depend on fossil fuels? All these problems are sitting there. We know what we need to do, but the problem, I think, has been that there's been a lack of political leadership to push that. And maybe also the WTO has lacked some of the tools that we would take for granted in modern politics and business. So it needs to be brought up to date. It needs to be brought up to date in terms of its internal functioning and its structures. It needs to be brought up to date in terms of the tools that can be utilized to help shape public opinion and government policy. It needs to focus on the real economies, particularly on SMEs, and we need to look to further liberalization. So if you like, from a conceptual level of our commitment to a multilateral rules-based system, as opposed to a chaotic free-for-all, and at a practical level, how we organize ourselves in Geneva and beyond to cooperate with other institutions, and then how at a policy level, including getting the dispute resolution mechanism up and running and working to ensure that our SMEs are fully taking advantage of global conditions, and then getting some of these stalled agreements moving again. Well, we know what we need to do. It's just a question of having the will to do it.
Definitely. Leadership question coming up again. But thank you so much for your time on the show. Very interesting times, and we'll see how things play out. We know that the selection date for the new Director General is getting closer. Eight candidates like yourself are going head-to-head for this position. Mexico, Moldova, Korea, Saudi Arabia, yourself from the United Kingdom. And we have 3 candidates from Africa joining in this race, and definitely quite a lot to look out for. Thank you so much for your time and for joining in this special CNBC Africa broadcast, and wish you all the best as you go on, Dr. Fox, for your
Well, thank you very much.
For me and the rest of the team, enjoy the rest of your day.